Hello and welcome to The Road to Copenhagen. I'm Susan McGinnis here with our executive editor, Margaret Ryan. We are looking now into what will happen after these climate talks coming up in Copenhagen. Some experts say we're going to see very little more out of this global meeting than an agreement just to keep on talking. Others say we cannot let this opportunity slip. What are you hearing, Margaret?
Well, President Obama, is expected to join other world leaders in the closing days of the Copenhagen talks. And as happened in Kyoto in 1997, a lot of people are saying, hey, when the world leaders finally get there at the 11th hour, they're going to pull out some kind of substantive agreement. But the lack of agreement specifics, so on a lot of specifics so far, has other observers saying, well, they may pull out some kind of framework, but it'll be an agreement to keep on talking, more like Rio was to Kyoto. And many observers believe that the key to any agreement is going to be a lot of these bilateral talks in other forums aside from the formal UNFCCC process. Especially being eyed is the US and China bilateral talks. President Obama is scheduled to go to Beijing in November, and a lot of people are hoping that what will come out of that is a template for a world agreement. I mean, if the world's two largest emitters, one of them largest developed economy and one of the largest developing economy, if they can agree on something, there's a pattern there for the rest of the world.
And also bilateral talks with India, between India and the U.S. are supposed to figure greatly in progress here too. But Margaret, the leaders of some of the largest nations, including the U.S. and China, did make a major agreement at climate talks earlier this year in L'Aquila, Italy. And this is where they made that 2°C temperature agreement.
That's right. They set that as their goal and said, whatever we do, we don't want the world's to increase the global mean temperature to increase above 2°C. Now, the problem is if more pessimistic scientists are right, that may already be a lost cause. IPCC scenarios initially set about 450 parts per million of carbon as a stabilization rate and thought from there, if you got there, and we were at 386 last year, if you kept it below 450, well, you could keep the heating below 2 degrees. But more recent data is indicating that's not the case. Your limit may be 400 parts per million, and some other studies claim it's only 350. We may already be past it. So, if that lower figure is correct, then we're already in for some inundation of climate, coastal regions. So that's why we're hearing so many leaders say, look, this is just too important to postpone. We can't decide in Copenhagen to keep talking. World leaders have to bite the bullet and decide what we're going to do to cut carbon now.
Okay, now talking about an agreement out of Copenhagen, if something does come out of it, what does the science say needs to be in it?
Well, right now to keep that rise below 2 degrees, what we're talking about are cuts in the developed countries, 25 to 40% by 2020, a number that I've heard Todd Stern say is just impossible for the United States, but that's what the science says. And the whole globe has to lower emissions 50 to 80%, sometimes scientists stick on the 80% end, by 2050. Otherwise, we're in for a big increase in global temperature. They say because carbon has been accumulating over all these years in the atmosphere, and the emissions cutbacks, the real problem for politicians is the emissions cutbacks won't have any noticeable effect for years. It's taken decades to get us where we are. It's going to take decades for the global system to cool back off. So there won't be any immediate feedback after all the efforts that the world's going to take.
Well, that sure is sounding pretty dire. And what if something doesn't come out of Copenhagen and there is just an agreement to keep talking?
Well, the world population is continuing to grow. We know that we've recently bypassed 6 billion people. We're growing at an accelerating rate. The projections are 9 billion people by 2050, if not earlier. The International Energy Agency has projected energy demand, and their BAU, their business as usual case, is that much of it of the demand is going to be met with fossil fuels as the population continues to rise. They estimate, we have the IPCC estimating you need a 50% cut by 2030, and with no action, the IEA says what we're going to get is a 50% increase in the use of fossil fuels and carbon by 2030.
Wow. Okay. Well, a lot at stake there in Copenhagen, and thank you very much, Margaret Ryan, for that look at beyond Copenhagen with what could be in an agreement, what happens if there is not one. I'm Susan McGinnis. Don't forget to check out all of our backgrounders on the road to Copenhagen, as well as news leading up to the talks, major players, negotiations so far, geopolitical issues, and more, all on our page called The Countdown to Copenhagen. I'm Susan McGinnis.